couldn't find the one light. Roland space. I've only got caves, Roland time. I've got so many machines that I'm trying to catch up with one, and I thought
I got it 2 years ago. One of the guys who normally comes here, not done this year, he's done pretty well himself. Oh really? And how long did he get these first years or? No, it's like snowboard. Oh, I see. Friday night before play, yeah, spent like a little bit before playing started. We've got a... How are you waiting? It's still got this guy, he's got a go tech, which will take you to the expansion court. Like a switch between go tech and play to Jigsaw Africa. I'm just gutted it to know, you know, we have no jack, tape player. There is a jack, but it's for alcohol, and it's just for headphones. Oh, microphone.
So you're trying to look what about the
No, the tape.
Oh, the tape. So because you can't play tape.
No, so I say, I've got a 464. This cartridge is this 6 months away, plus the minute 464.
There's no SSD.
That's the downside. If you get the mic jack, like all the other amps, it would play disc, tape, go set, and jigsaw.
The only thing to do is turn the Wi-Fi to get that through there.
Yeah.
You don't know the modding, you know the modding.
Yeah.
I like the sense of it.
Right then, Play Expo 2024. Let me check in on those energy levels. How are we feeling?
Yeah.
Nice. Okay, well, keep that energy going because this has been a long time in the making to get this next guest, and I know we've got a lot of people here who are very excited to meet him. We are celebrating 40 years of the Amstrad. I don't know if you've noticed. We're celebrating 40 years of the Amstrad CPC. And so, what an amazing thing to have. We've got the man behind it himself, Mr. Roland Perry is here. Make some noise! Keep it coming, come on! So, Roland.
Yeah, hello.
40 years of the CPC. I think you've found yourself going to a lot of talks and conferences and conventions this year. What's that been like to realise the amount of love that's out there for this humble machine?
I think it's taught me a lot about which aspects people like, what parts of the story people are interested in, and it's been a delight. I've been travelling, I won't say all over the world, but travelling here, there and everywhere. This is probably about the 7th or 8th convention like this I've been to in the last 6 months.
And have you been surprised over the years about the ongoing enthusiasm, or is it something which you've noticed has got bigger and bigger over time?
In fact, in the UK, it's been a very slow burn. Okay, I wanted to do something like this for the 35th, but people just didn't seem interested for some reason. Whereas in Spain, where the Amstrad was the most popular home computer for all sorts of reasons, they've been doing retro events like this for about 10 years, 10 or 12 years. And retro events like this happen, not just for computers, they happen for old cars and vinyl records and things like that, because people get to a certain age where they can now afford to indulge themselves in reliving their childhood when they were 10, 11, 12 years old.
Well, he's spot on there, really, isn't he? So if you notice that the enthusiasm maybe wasn't where it should be in the 35th year, I think, have we made up for it now in the 40th year?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm not going to jump in on this story when you went to Amstrad, if that's okay. I'm just interested in when you were growing up, Roland, was there a point at which you realised you were just interested in how things work? When did that sort of begin?
Well, I think always. It wasn't always computers, because until I was about, 15, 16 years old, which would have been in the late 60s, computers was things that you didn't have access to. So I was more interested in electronics, particularly things that known as ham radio, building amplifiers, all that sort of thing. And it's really getting interested in computers as such came about when products like the Z80 and the Motorola 6800s were introduced, which was a little bit after that.
And when that machine came out, because it came out in kit form as well, did you sort of purchase one, start looking into it, try to work out how it worked?
So which machine's that?
Oh, you mentioned the ZX81?
Yeah, okay, well, I didn't buy one, I never did buy one. I bought some of Sinclair's earlier products, his audio products, his had an FM radio, bought one of those. And as far as his computers were concerned, I'd kind of moved on at that point to rather more, what in those days were kind of small business computers, things like the Altair 8080 and Vector Graphics. Was a firm that I used to have a franchise for in the UK. XD Sorcerer was a very popular machine at that time. So I kind of missed out on the early, I never had an MK14, never had a X80 or X81. But then I kind of fell into another one of my multitude of careers, which was being a freelance journalist. So I used to write reviews of various things.
Great.
And so I did a review of the BBC Micro when it was first launched. I haven't brought it here today, but I had it on display last weekend at a different retro event, an original circuit diagram of the BBC Micro.
And when you first saw the BBC Micro, at that stage were you thinking, this is too big, it's too heavy, it needs more colour? What were you thinking when you saw it?
When I saw it, at that stage, I was just reviewing it in order to inform the public, my readers, what was good about it, what was bad about it, all the rest of it. And it was perfectly okay at its time. One of the things that we did 2.5 years later was to look back on that and say, well, this is the way they did things on the BBC Micro, that's the way they did it on the Commodore 64. On the other hand, the ZX81's different in these kinds of ways. How could we build a computer that learns from 2.5 years of hindsight to put something together that kind of gelled in a way that people found attractive?
And it's almost as though these other companies were doing some of your kind of prototyping for you.
Yeah, exactly, yes, yes, I think they were.
So we'll talk in just 1 second then about how you came along to Amstrad. A figure that comes up in my research is William, who you were a childhood friend, William Paul.
Indeed, yes, we were at school. He actually had a ham radio license, G8CYK.
Yeah.
So I was never that interested in ham radio as a way of communicating with people. But there we go. I was more interested in the way of how do you use modern because we're just on the cusp where you're going from World War II surplus radio transmitters and receivers to building your own ones using very early semiconductors.
Yeah, it just struck me that you were childhood friends, but then you then go off in your own directions. You come back together and you form. Is that how Ambit comes together?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I went to Cambridge and studied engineering, and a course at the time which had absolutely no computing in it at all. We're doing slide rules and very early HP calculators. The problem with the HP calculators was that the cost, or the price, was as much as a whole year's student grant. So not very many people had them. But yes, we got together and he started a company which was because he wanted to build ham radios out of these latest semiconductors. He went to companies like Mullard, one of the major producers at the time, and he said, well, I'd like to buy this, make a 2-metre portable radio or something. They said, well, that's fine. Our minimum order's 100. And because there were no retailers doing them 1s and 2s, so what he did was, his idea was to start a retailer, mainly mail order, but we also had a little shop, where he bought 100, kept 2 for himself, and sold the other 98 in small ads in the back of Practical Wireless and Practical Electronics and whatever.
Yeah. And I know there was a bit of a false start with the development of the Amstrad CPC originally. What was it, do you think, about Ambit and how you guys were positioned at the time that made you Plan B that turned out to be, well, the rest is history?
Well, we all kind of, we looked upon ourselves as a kind of project rescue organisation, because we sold a lot of these leading edge electronic components which weren't necessarily very easy to use. If you wanted to make something that was basically the manufacturer's application note, then you could just copy it. If you wanted to make something slightly different, you needed to understand how it worked better. So one of our tasks was, when people bought these components off us, often small manufacturers who were thinking of startups, not so much computers, but things like hi-fi systems, FM radios in the early days of FM stereo, or some of the chips that we were selling. They come to us and they say, well, we'd like to buy 5,000 sets of parts off you, because that's what our initial production run is going to be, but we can't seem to make it work. And so we said, well, why don't you just kind of drop round one weekend and we'll help you get it to work, because then you can buy the 5,000 sets of parts off us, and that's where we make our money. So it's kind of like a free consultancy. And one day, one of the people who dropped in to see us was Bob Watkins, who brought this thing here, which is the kind of version 0.1 of the 464 circuit board. And what people need to know is that this box was something that Amstrad had designed about a year before this.
Yeah.
Because they decided they wanted this and they knew what it needed to look like, except it didn't have a circuit board in it. It had everything else. So they wanted someone to make a circuit board. So they commissioned these guys, gave them about 6 months to design an 8-bit home computer with BASIC from scratch, which is impossible. So it's not the fault of the 2 guys who failed to produce it. It's just that the timescale was impossible. So they then came to us and said, well, can you rescue this project? Oh, by the way, the timescale is now 3 months.
Do you remember quite vividly that day then when Bob is presumably the first time you hear from Amstrad, that's the first contact you made? Do you remember quite vividly that conversation? And
No, well, it wasn't the first contact, because we'd done some rescue of some of their previous projects, particularly a CB radio, which they'd sold a few years before. But their business model was to have actually dozens of products, many of which were not nearly as famous, many of which didn't even have their brand name on, but they were sold through other shops with other people's brand names on. But every year they had what they called a blockbuster product. So one year it would be CB radios, another year it would be a twin tape video recorder. Yeah. And then this particular year, what they'd already decided was their blockbuster product would be a home computer.
Yeah.
And so, having failed to find anybody internally, because they were audio, TV, VCR engineers, they didn't have any particular expertise in computers. Well, why would they? But they had lots of expertise in this kind of industrial design. Makes the products actually manufacturable. And so they looked for one set of subcontractors who'd let them down. So they wanted to look for, in a hurry, a different set of subcontractors who would do the circuit board for them.
Did that strike you as unusual that the box came first, or was that sort of typical of Amstrad at the time? Because I know which CB radio you're talking about. I actually have one. It's the 901, and it's a nice looking machine. Everything it has that look about it that's very 80s. It's nice. It's flashing lights, and so was that not unusual for them to come to you with a design and expect you to fill it with the genius?
Well, I think the thing is, if it's a television or a video recorder or CB radio or something like that, you can actually find someone to design you the board to go inside, because it's fairly mature, fairly stable, well understood technology. And at the time, it wasn't, that wasn't the case for 8-bit home computers. Most of the computers that we were, in a sense, competing against, Commodore 64, Sinclair Spectrum, had taken dozens of engineers, a year or more to design.
And people would want me to ask this. Do you remember the first time you met Lord Sugar, and what was your impressions of him at the time?
Well, this is well documented in many of the sort of biographies and autobiographies and magazine articles over the years. I went and assembled a team of people who I thought could deliver the product. We then had a meeting at Amstrad headquarters, which is in Garmin Road in Tottenham, and we went there and we met Bob Watkins, and sat in the corner was this little chap, and as my friend Medj, the hardware design, said, well, he noticed this chap must be the boss, because when he started talking, everybody else stopped talking. We'd literally just got off a plane from the Far East, scouting for other products. But you couldn't scout for a product like this in the Far East because nobody was doing it. The only possible Far Eastern equivalent of this would have been an MSX machine. Yeah. Okay, and that's quite, they were okay, but they weren't spectacular, and it would have taken a year to turn a white label MSX machine into something that would go in there. So that's the first time I met him in that meeting there, and he's always been the most honest, straightforward, decent person to deal with. Yeah. He says what he wants. If you say you can do it, he says go ahead, and then you go off and do it.
And what he wanted, the brief was take the best of the Commodore 64. What was?
Well, they gave us. They put together. They looked at the Commodore 64 particularly, but also the Spectrum, the BBC Micro,
yep,
and a few other machines in the pipeline. And there was the Enterprise Elan, which everyone called the Flan at the time, which had an impressive specification, which they eventually never really managed to deliver. There was also the Dragon, which was another one, which was kind of a sort of in the pipeline. So you can put it together and you can say, well, a computer's got to have 16 colours. Okay? Except it's not 16 colours, it's 8 colours, and 8 colours is brighter. And so it goes on. So you can draw up a kind of a spec that says it's got to have 64K of memory, it's got to have a processor, it's got to have a sound chip, it's got to have printer port. And then you just have to produce a board which then delivers that inside. And at the time, writing a BASIC was quite difficult because there was nobody who really sold an off-the-shelf BASIC apart from Microsoft, and that was the MSX, and we'd already ruled that out. I went and talked to the people who did the Spectrum BASIC, but they weren't interested in doing that kind of thing anymore. They moved on with doing other things.
Had that created, I'm sure I remember, had that created some kind of, not licensing problem, but they'd had a problem where the people that did the BASIC for the Spectrum sort of still owned it, kind of thing? Is that
yes, Clive Sinclair or somebody else at Sinclair had forgotten to get them to sign a piece of paper assigning the copyright of the Spectrum ROM to them. Well, that's why you need lots of lawyers around to make sure mistakes like that don't happen.
Yeah, and business people. So let's go into that a little bit more then. So how did you end up with the is it locomotive?
Locomotive BASIC. Well, this is again, it's kind of wheels within wheels. The BBC Micro has a system which we've got parts of it in this, which is second processors and sideways ROMs. So we've got what BBC calls sideways ROMs implemented in this, in all the plug-in peripherals. But they also had second processors, because their idea was, well, we've got a 6502 platform here. In future, you might want to plug a 16-bit micro on the card into it. In fact, you've got BBC Master in the exhibition out there, which is designed to have all these second processors plugged in. And one of the second processors, which Acorn had under development at the time, was a Z80 second processor. And it was clear that that then needed a BASIC for it. And these people that I already sort of knew had written the BASIC for the BBC Micro Z80 second processor. But that project had got stalled for all sorts of reasons. So actually Acorn was fairly dysfunctional internally in terms of I don't know, scheduling and delivering on products. One of the things I've always said I liked about working at Amstrad is I probably worked on 16 to 18 projects. All but one ended up in the shops.
Yeah.
All right? Whereas at Acorn it was the other way round. They worked on 10 different products and only 2 of them ended up in the shops. And that's quite disheartening for development engineers, because they put all this work in and then somebody somewhere kind of loses faith in it, or it turns out to be too expensive or not to work well enough, and you move on. So anyway, so the guys who'd written, there's Locomotive, had written the Z80 second processor, BASIC. And I said, well, I'm looking for a BASIC. Could you convert this BASIC for me to be on the 464? Their BASIC was more like a business BASIC, because the BBC Micro was more of a kind of an educational small business computer. And they've written that, and I said, well, could you add some frills to this, to add some sound and some graphics and so on and so forth? And they said, well, we're not doing anything else at the moment, so why not? So they did.
Yeah, and that whole, at the time, and I do agree that it seems to me that Amstrad always had that business head on their shoulders, in a way that Acorn felt more academic, and so that wasn't there. And I think one of the best decisions they made was sending it out with the monitor, that you got the monitor with it and you didn't have to sort of unplug Nan's television to get the thing to work. Do you remember that decision coming along?
Well, that had been made long before we were involved, and the idea was that you had a 100% ready-to-go system. So you had the keyboard, you had the cassette drive in it, and you had a monitor, because if you didn't have the monitor, you buy this computer for your young teenage son, usually a son, and then there's a fight, because Mum wants to watch Coronation Street, whereas the son wants to play shoot-me-up games.
Yeah.
And so the idea, which I rose long before I was involved in the project, was to say, well, you've got to ship it with a monitor, because then he can take it up to his bedroom or in the dining room or something and do whatever he wants to do, and Mum can still watch Coronation Street.
And you mentioned there the games, and one of the things that famously Clive Sinclair wasn't really taken by the gaming side of the spectrum, and it sort of took him by surprise when it happened. Was that kind of hardwired into the approach at Amstrad, that this was a games machine, and was it initially well supported by the software houses?
Well, one of the sort of important features of the development project wasn't just to produce a circuit board to go inside, but it was to create an industry producing games for it. And the original decree was that there should be 50 games available by the time it was in the shops. Launch. No, not launch, when it was in the shops. Okay, so the launch was at Easter, it was in the shops from June, and the idea was that we'd organised software houses, obviously somebody here with an Ocean t-shirt on, companies like that, to convert some of their games. 90% were conversions rather than new games. And so we had to build up this team of people who would encourage software houses to convert their games to a computer that wasn't in the shops yet. So they had to be convinced that it really was going to be in the shops. And one of the things, I brought some of these posters along here, so the top one on the left there is a manual which we gave to software developers. That's just the cover page of it, that said, this is how this computer works. Therefore, anything we can do to help you design your you know, convert your games or to port your games to the Sinclair or the Commodore 64, then we'll give you every help we can. And the other part of the help, of course, was for those software houses to give them a prototype machine, which we hand-built, because it was long before the production line was started. So there were 50 grey system units, almost identical to that. I mean, 99% the same as that. But the only difference is they had little labels stuck on the back rather than this raised writing on them. And so we built 50, well, we were supposed to build 50 of them, but some of the bits and pieces didn't work, so we ended up cannibalising them and building about 45. And they're the grey ones, which I noticed you've got some pictures of which I don't know how many survived. I know the whereabouts of 2 of them.
We've got plenty of Amstrad experts in the room. Anyone know what happened to those machines? Looking at you, Chris.
I think most of them were just discarded when either 5 years later when software houses were stopping doing Amstrad games and said, well, we don't need that anymore and just threw it away, or when they said, well, we'd rather be developing our games for a real one than this prototype, which might not exactly work the same, except it did exactly work the same, but they weren't to know that. So of those 45, as I know the whereabouts of 2 of them, and maybe some more will emerge from people's attics eventually.
They'll turn up on eBay eventually.
Turn up on eBay, yeah.
Do you remember some of those games coming in and, you know, them, you know, saying, okay, have a look at this, what do you think? Do you remember those coming in and what your impressions were of some of those launch titles?
Well, the first 2 games we had were written or converted by Indiscomp in Spain from their existing titles. So one was Roland on the Ropes and Roland in the Cave. So they were the first 2 games that we saw. Harrier Attack, I think, was the 3rd one. And so we tended to use Harrier Attack as the machine to demonstrate to journalists and whatever.
Yeah.
Because it's an easier game to play than the 2 Indiscomp games.
Yeah.
So you want to give if somebody's going to review a computer, don't give them a game that's almost impossible to play.
Yeah.
So give them one that's kind of easier to play. So we used Harrier Attack. And yes, we looked at them. It wasn't our role really to criticise the gameplay or the graphics or anything. We just said, well, thanks for that, we'll add it to our catalogue. Mm-hmm. The only 2 games which we had much influence over the development of was Roland in Time, where the developer came and sat in the corner of my office and we gave him some equipment to write it on. He wrote it on a Spectrum with microdrives. A bit frightening.
This is new information. So he sat in the corner of your office?
Yeah, with a Spectrum and microdrives writing Roland in Time. And occasionally I'd go and peer over his shoulder and say, well, why didn't you make that slightly different or this slightly different? That's the only one that actually had any real personal involvement in the development of it. So he eventually ended up finishing that game and we published it. And then about a year later, I think he wrote Roland in Space, but I wasn't really involved in that. So yeah, we were interested in it being a games playing machine, but we were also interested in it being a educational, again with the 6128, particularly a small business machine, because with CPM on the 6128 you could run fairly standard small business software. Sage, for example, very famous now, their accounting software.
Yeah. They
They started off writing small business accounting programs, payrolls and things for the 6128.
And it does deliberately, the 6128 does have the look as though it's moving in a more business-like, and was that the aim? I mean, eventually you ended up with was it the PCW range of?
That's right. Well, I think the idea was that if you wanted a games computer, it would be more the 464 and the 664.
Yeah.
And yes, some of the markets who wanted to sell, because the UK wasn't our only market. We were selling just as many, or possibly even more, in France and Germany and Spain and the USA. And that's where we get a bit kind of, I think this is part of where this sort of retro denial comes from. In the UK, people think that the Spectrum is the biggest, most popular, most successful computer. But we made nearly as many CPCs as Sinclair made Spectrums.
Yeah.
It's just that all the Spectrums ended up, or almost all of them ended up in the UK, but our CPCs were spread across 5 or 6 countries around the world.
Yeah. Did you have a CPC at launch? Did you have one at home?
Well, I had the original prototype from months before.
But did they send you one through the post with the monitor, and did you?
Well, they didn't need to send me one to the post. My office was full of them. You get sick of the sight of them.
Well, talking of sick of the sight, what did you think of the decision to do a discounted one that was green screen? Did you think that was a good?
No, the green screen's a really good idea because it allows it to be sold at a more affordable price point.
Yeah.
Also, because of the way we designed the colour mapping, you could run the same games in monochrome or grayscale on the grayscale monitor as you could on the colour monitor. You didn't have to tell it in advance, oh, you're going to be playing on a colour screen or playing on a monochrome screen. You just plug it in. So yes, a lot of people bought the games and they're perfectly playable on the monochrome screen, and maybe one day you'd buy a colour monitor to plug into it.
But it was just
the colour monitor, incidentally, has got the same pin out as the Acorn colour monitor, BBC Micro monitor. So maybe you get a second-hand Acorn monitor and plug that in, that would work.
Well, it was just such a colourful machine versus the competition at the time. How did you end up on? Is it 27 colours? How did you end up on that?
Yeah, 27 colours was, as I said earlier, 16 colours is 8 colours and 8 colours brighter. Mm-hmm. That's because you've got on and off in red, green and blue. And one of the designers came to us and said, well, what if I could do 27 colours for you? And we said, well, how are you going to do that then? He said, well, instead of just on and off with 3 colours, we can have on, off and halfway. Mm-hmm. Right, so that's 3, on, off and halfway. 3 times 3 times 3 is 27. That's where 27 colours come from.
Was there ever anything with the development of the CPC that you thought this could delay us, this could be the thing that stops us meeting that deadline of the 3 months? Was there anything that was particularly?
That's an interesting question.
Thank you.
I think probably everything. And there's always, again, there's a chart, which is the middle one on that pillar there, which is my original. That I did within about a week of taking on the project. And it's a critical path analysis, and it shows the development pathways of the hardware design, software design, the what I call the frilly stuff design, which is things like instruction books and manuals and that sort of thing, and welcome tape. It has to have a welcome tape in it. So what you have to do is you can't run a welcome tape on a hardware that doesn't yet exist. So you have to get the hardware going first, then you can send somebody else off to write the basic, and then somebody else to write the welcome tape. And so it all happens in parallel. And any one thing on that chart not working would push the deadline out. Except we weren't allowed to push the deadline out because, and this is what eventually was the demise of so many homegrown computer companies, is if you've got your computer in the shops in October and November, people buy it for Christmas. You get it in the shops by January and February, nobody's interested. But it has to be there, it has to be on the high street in October, or you're dead.
And it was indeed, it was 11:30 a.m, so this is the launch, 11:30 a.m. on Thursday the 12th of April 1984 at Westminster School, London, and the press were invited to come and meet Einstein, Archimedes, William Shakespeare, Monet and Ravel, so someone got carried away there. Do you remember that event, and what was the buzz like?
That's a wacky idea of Nick Hewer, who's become more famous recently as a sort of TV pundit. Yeah. He said, because we were asking for ideas about how, you need a kind of a gimmick. And he said, well, what if we could find people with these surnames in the UK? And you could write, because they're all, like Ravel, for example, is music. Monet is graphics. Right. So we picked all these kind of famous people who had something to do with one of the aspects of the computer. And So he went out and he found, although they're a bit of an eclectic bunch, he found people whose genuine surnames matched those, and they came to the launch, and we wrote some special software which demonstrated their particular aspects. So for Ravel, we had a tape loaded up which played some music or whatever, and that was the gimmick at the press launch.
So that makes more sense now. It's quite a good idea.
Yeah.
So the team at the time, from what I could see, there was only 20 or 30 of you. Am I right on that, actually working on the project at the time? You must know them all by name, I presume.
Yeah, probably. Probably remember most of them. Particularly in the last sort of 5 years or so, we've come back together again as a clan. So there's basically 4 teams of people. There was my team, which were doing coordinating the development work, doing things that nobody else wanted to do, right? Not nobody else could do, but nobody else wanted to do. Nobody wanted to write the welcome tape. So I eventually said, all right, well, I'll do it then. Anyway, nobody really wanted to write the text for the bottom one down there, which is the brochure that we had. So we got together, we did that. So we did all these bits and pieces that kind of glue it all together. And I had a team which ended up as about 10 people. We eventually called it Amsoft. And they then had a user club and a magazine.
Yeah.
But up until the point of it being in the shops, it was about 10 people. So my job was to kind of recruit and manage that team of 10 people. We then had Image Electronics, which started off as 2 people, and then it became 3, and then it became 4, 5, or 6. Who designed the hardware, they designed the chips, like the custom chips that powered the machine. And we had locomotive software that again started off as 2 people, became 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, in fact, I met several of them the other day. The 4th team was people from Amstrad who've been designing consumer electronics for the previous 15, 20 years, who knew how to get plastic cases done.
Yeah.
Like in the past, it was plastic cases for televisions and hi-fis and video recorders, so they could just churn one of these out in their sleep. Okay, there's people who knew how to buy electronic components. So you end up with a list of all. Well, it's not the actual board, obviously, but you end up with a list of all the chips. So you have to go to Japan and say to people, well, how much 8 DRAM chips? How much are you going to sell them to me? What if I ordered? Okay, what if I ordered 200,000 instead of 100,000? What would the price be then? There's people who've been doing that for years and years and years. People designing adverts, television adverts. People actually getting the printing done for brochures like that. So once you've given them the words, then they need to typeset it and print it and deliver it to the high street stores. So there's all those people working for Amazon, people who did, it was a young lady called Karen did the graphics for all the games. But before that she was doing graphics for other products. So we kind of borrowed these people. Yeah. So we're borrowing the talents of about 10 or a dozen other people in Amstrad. So altogether, it probably probably 30, 40 people were involved in it in one way or another. And then on the bottom one on that pillar there is some of the team that were involved. So you've got Grumpy Jaws in the middle there. There's me. There's Bob Watkins. On the bottom right, there's Medge. Top was Richard Clayton from Locomotive. On the left, William Pole. So we're just a team. But my job was to whip them all into shape and make sure they're all doing the right thing at the right time. Yep. And then when they got a bit stuck, to give them a bit of a hand on it. Because I could have done the whole project myself. It would have taken me 10 years. So if you want to do it in 6 months, you need the help of 20 other people.
Well, it works, and one of the things that, I don't know if anyone said this to you before, but there is something about the CPC, which it's kind of built like a tank, because you can literally have it in your loft for 20 years, you can imagine all the winters and summers and winters, bring it down, plug it in, it works. How did you do that? Well,
I think that's just down to, that's the product, procuring the components. you're just procuring the same components that previously you'd have put in transistor radios and colour television, things like that. And you wouldn't necessarily, you know, if you had a cassette tape recorder in your attic and you brought it down after 30 years, you wouldn't necessarily expect it to have expired in some way. You expect it to just plug in and work. So if you use the same kind of grade of components in a computer, then they do mainly seem to just plug in and work.
They do indeed. Now, folks, I know there's lots of things you're dying to know that I haven't asked Roland, because that's because I'm expecting you to ask him those questions. So, for now, give Roland a round of applause. And I'm going to come out amongst you and we'll get your questions, and hopefully you won't let me down. I know you won't. Put your hands up if you've got a question for Roland Perry, please.
Simple one, Roland. What one is your favourite?
During what game is my favourite?
What system?
Oh, what system? Oh, 6128, definitely. Because it was, we had more time to write the manual, but it's about this thick. It's a how to learn computing book. It's not just how does this computer work book. And it's got a disk drive built in. It's got CPM, you can run business software on it. So that's kind of, yeah, definitely the 6128. And it would have been the 664 had it survived. The problem with 664 is that it got overtaken by the 6128. But that could have been the favourite one there. I mean, to some extent, the 6128 didn't need to exist, apart from the fact that American colleagues said, well, we can't sell a computer that's only got 64K memory in it. That's, you know, old hat now, so you've got to build one with 128. Even if nobody's ever going to write a game that's uses 128K of RAM. Now somebody's going to stick their hand up and say, oh, I wrote a game that needed 128K. But actually, people wouldn't write games like that because you could only run it on that computer. You couldn't run it on these two. So why would you limit your market? So I think the very vast majority of games all run in 64K.
Okay, hands up.
In hindsight, what would you change about the CPC if you were to, you know, go back in time and design it again? What do you think could have been done differently or better?
I'd probably have stuck an 8-bit printer port on it.
Because that would mean it could be used for more business-like.
Well, yes, because we had the problem with printers at the time, and it's still the case, is that you've got a printer that has an 8-bit character set in it. But in order to send characters to a printer, you've got to have an 8-bit port plus one that you waggle. So you put the data on the 8 bits and you waggle this one to say, right, there's the data to print that character. And the problem is that if you've only got 8 bits left on your output port, you've got to use the 8th bit to do the waggling, and then you then get 7 bits of data. But you can use escape codes because you can send an escape code that says, look out, here comes the first half of an 8-bit character, and now comes the second half of an 8-bit character. But that seems to be too much trouble for most people writing software. So I think I'd make it an 8-bit printer port and try and find that one other bit to waggle up and down from somewhere else.
Hands up.
Hello, just my question. Why was the Amstrad so popular in France, do you think?
Mainly because we translated the manuals and the sales literature and the keyboard and everything into French. Because the French are a bit fussy about that kind of thing, and hardly anybody else bothered. I don't think you'll find a French Commodore 64 or a Spectrum or a BBC Micro.
A couple of questions. Schneider, was that popular in Germany? Because I don't hear much about it. And secondly, you've got multiple careers. Which one are you most proud of?
Well, can we take those two questions separately? Schneider was a long-term partner of Amstrad. They were their distributor in Germany, and they sold, you know, their earlier music systems and TVs and video recorders in Germany. In fact, Schneider's still going as a company. was quite surprised. I had my house rewired about a year ago. The guy turns up with the Schneider consumer unit to stick on my wall. I think, oh. I said to him, oh, I used to know Bernie Schneider. And he's thinking, oh, of course you did. So this was just their latest product that year. But they positioned the products much more as business products rather than as games computers. So they wanted I think they had largely monochrome keyboards in Germany for the CPCs. They promoted the BCW as not as a word processor but as a CPM engine, so they had a different view on it. So no, Schneider was that was our long-term distributor in Germany. We had our own distributor in France, Amstrad France, Indiscomp, who were a bit of a games software developer. They became our distributor in Spain, and some kind of friends of Indiscomp started up Amstrad USA. So, but we also had smaller distribution affiliates or subsidiaries in lots of other countries like Australia, and Denmark actually took quite a lot of the PCWs. Again, because we bothered to translate everything into Danish, which people didn't used to do. I mean, I remember a couple of years later when we were doing MS-DOS and Windows, Microsoft came to us and said, well, you're going to want this in lots of different languages, aren't you? And we said, well, yes, obviously. They said, well, we do English, really. We do French, German, Italian, and Spanish. And I showed this to the Spanish translator, and he said, no, it's English, German, Italian, French, and Mexican. Oh, yeah. So we did the first Spanish MS-DOS and Windows. But then we went on to do, did the world's first Russian MS-DOS, for example, because again we had distribution deals in all sorts of countries like that. Now, as for which bit of my career and subsequent careers, it's like asking who's your favourite child. Probably the work I did with my late wife about 12 years ago on the law on what's called coercive control, which is all about men and their partners and the kind of domestic abuse. I think getting laws passed about that and teaching the world that it was actually an important phenomenon that they needed to take care of. I think that's probably the one.
And I can take another question, if you can get in quick, anybody?
Lindsay?
Hello. You've given us lots of information about the development and all the prep work up until launch. What are some of the key things you did to get the most out of the life cycle of the products?
I think, there's two or three things there. First of all, doing all the work to translate it, not just literally translating the words, but having foreign keyboards on, like the French have an AZERTY keyboard, for example. The Spanish wanted a keyboard with an Enya key on it. So that increased its life cycle, producing its successors. Okay, that increases the life cycle. But just generally being nice to your distributors and customers, producing a user magazine. There's quite a lot of the UK specialist computer industry which started off doing Amstrad magazines. So Amstrad Action, Amstrad User. There's one that was called Putting Your Amstrad to Work, which we used to call Putting Your Amstrad to Sleep because it was so boring, and so on and so forth.
Do you feel like you're building a community?
Absolutely, yes, it had to, that was vital. Just building this, so just using one's enthusiasm to build a community of people who believe in the product, believe it will be a success, and put their life and soul into not just the computer itself, but all the other things, all the peripherals that other people built, the software that other people wrote, the magazines that other people published. Very important, yeah.
And finally, I've got to ask Roland, whose idea was it to put you in space and on the ropes? And
okay, well this is Lord Sugar's idea, because there was Super Mario, I think, that had a little character in it, and there was at least another one set of games that had a character in, and so he had the idea that you should brand any game, certainly of that first tranche of games, that had a little character jumping up and down, that he thought it was amusing to call it Roland.
Did you think it was amusing?
I don't know. I didn't object to it. I thought, nowadays I think, well, actually, it's done me no harm. But at the time, it was just another one of 100 other things that I was having to think about.
Well, today was Roland at the Norbrec, and we're standing room only on this, and quite right too, for the man that created the legend. Show your appreciation, please, for Roland Perry.
Can I just say, I'm here for the rest of today and probably a couple of hours tomorrow morning. If any of you want to talk to me, take a selfie, or sign your computer, just, that's what I'm here for, okay? So don't apologise.
Thank you very much, and great questions again from you lot. You're on good form. Join us at 4:30. We've got John and Brenda Romero who are doing a special talk on entering the industry. And then tomorrow, we're back at 12 o'clock with Bullfrog and Lionhead and 2 Point development legend Mr. Gary Carr. That is at 12 o'clock. And then at 2, we've got creator of Q-Boys, Warren Davis. So lots more to come. Enjoy your evening, everybody. One more time, Roland Perry.